guess we're getting up to 6:30. I should probably get started for. Yep, especially when we have online. Well, and good evening, and it's good to see everyone. And that not as many people have written from that perspective. And then the last week, we really wanted to really free it up for a lot of question and answer. And so in this time, again, if you are online, whether you're in person, if you have any questions that we haven't gotten to, or something that, we talked about this back 3 weeks ago, and this came to mind later on, and you want to go back and ask a question, or I know that we have people that are watching after the event, and so there are some people that are watching because it's being posted online, and so you might watch afterwards, and you're like, well, I had this question, but I didn't get to ask it because by the time you're watching it, it was all done. Or if it's something that we haven't talked about at all, that's what I'm hoping to do some on that last week. So we're going to talk some about some contemporary topics. How do we deal with issues of, some of the contemporary things about, a lot of it is sexual issues. And this evening again, and for the chance that we have to talk about these issues of faith, Father, understanding not only what we believe and why we believe it. Father, I thank you that you have called us to a reasonable faith, a faith that is consistent with reason. Father, thank you for the opportunity that we have to talk about these things. And I pray now for your blessing on our discussion. Help us to grow in our confidence of what we believe and why we believe it. Father, I pray that you would bless our discussion in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we're this evening, we're going to kind of do a little bit of part two of last week and then go a little beyond that. And so we're going to continue with creation, evolution, but then also we're going to talk some about morality and how that impacts. And so there's some questions about, how can a good God allow that is evil, and how can you believe in God when you see all the evil in the world? But even beyond that, those things are not only kind of philosophical discussions, but the whole question of right and wrong overlaps some with the issue of creation and evolution. So in other words, one of the questions that we have to look at, which we'll get to, is that if you believe in evolution, then how do we know what's right and wrong? How do you define right and wrong? Where does right and wrong come from? And so it's not only a question of these bigger questions of, how do you believe in a good God when there's evil in the world, but then also how does this, if you don't believe in God, then how do you even define evil? And so that's where we're going to end up this evening. But being that it is kind of part two, last week, as each week we kind of recommend some resources. They're in the notes, and last week, so we recommended some, and I'm going to re-recommend some of the same ones. Case for Creator, it's both a good book and a video series on Right Now Media. You have God's Crime Scene. Again, it's a very good book and a video series on Right Now Media. And so if you wanted to read it or do the video series, either way. And then a couple video series, that aren't so much the book, but they're just the video series, Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis. And then going outside of purely the scientific one, those were all recommended last week. A really good one is called Apologetics by William Lane Craig. He's got a lot of stuff on Right Now Media. This is one that I'll recommend that deals some with creation, evolution, but also, we're going to talk about even some of these arguments that he's talking about today. We're going to talk about the cosmological argument and what that means, and the suffering and evil, and so there's some of those issues as well. And he does some great stuff. This one is really kind of a little more some of his stuff is really heavy. This one series is a lot more user-friendly, and so it's some relatively short videos where he talks about different subjects. And again, it's a really good series that kind of builds on what we're saying today, as well as even going a little deeper. So as we dive into this tonight, again, we're building off of this, and let me kind of set back some context. And again, saying what we're looking at, we're we're really looking at two different questions of where do we come from. One is that a story, Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good. And you have the whole story of creation. Now, that's one story. Another story is, in the beginning there was nothing, and from that nothing, a singularity formed, a small spot of nothingness. And suddenly the singularity exploded with great force, and that explosion created all the matter in the whole universe. And it was an explosion that not only created that matter, but brought order to that matter, so that somehow magically it organized itself into stars and galaxies and planets, and then into life. Now, those are two different stories about the creation of not only the world that we see, but of matter itself, of space and time and everything that exists. And so what we're going to look at is well, which one of those, both of them cannot be true. Pretty much you'd say that one is probably true and the other is not, because there's not a whole lot of other options. So one is true, one is fabrication, and the question is, which one? And what you see in that whole discussion is, I'm just going to do some introductory points here, is that we've got to realize that in this whole argument, as a foundational truth, everyone has to believe in something that's eternal and transcendent. Some people argue that one is the story of science and one is the story of religion, and they can't be compared. But again, we've seen in previous weeks that that's a false dichotomy. Both creation and evolution claim to tell a story about science, about what's real in the world, about what happened, but they also tell a story about history, about what happened in the past. And they both tell a story about religion, about ultimate reality, about where we came from and why we're here, where we're going. Neither side can ultimately prove the truthfulness of their claims. You can't go back and put in a test tube and see it. You can't go back to the beginning of the universe and replay how it happened. But while we can't scientifically prove God's existence, an evolutionist can't prove that God doesn't exist either. And the question is, which one is more consistent with the facts? But that what you need to realize is that both the evolutionists and the creationists, both the materialist and the theist, both of them at the end of the day have a belief. They believe something, but it is something that is based on, number one, it's a leap of faith. They appeal to science, but it's a question of science is only going to take you so far. What is more consistent with science, and then where's the leap? And both of these ultimately have a belief in something that is eternal and transcendent. Meaning, we're going to see in a moment that we have everything, and everything had to come from somewhere. And so you've got to, at the end of the day, say, okay, either matter is existent forever, or whether there's a God that created matter, or whether there was some singularity that existed that somehow we don't know where that came from, and it created everything. But there's something that had to exist. And so what you're looking at is all of us believe in something that pre-existed time and space. And the question is, what is that? Now, all of the views of the origin in life appeal to science and require faith. So again, this is that speaking against kind of that perception, well, that's science and this is faith. And no, all the views, as a creationist, I appeal to science, and it requires faith that goes beyond science. An evolutionist likewise appeals to science, and it goes to faith beyond science. Now, what they will talk about is that they'll try to conflate science with materialism or scientism, and saying, okay, well, that's what, we know that material has always existed. Well, no, you don't know that. Again, that's that leap of faith. That's not scientifically provable. But the idea is because we can't test the supernatural, therefore it's anti-science. Well, no, it's not. Both of us believe in something that is transcendent against time and space. Both of us require science, but the question is, what is the faith that is most consistent with the evidence? And that's what we're looking at throughout this whole process, is we're looking at, there's a leap of faith, but it should be a leap of faith toward the light, not a leap of faith into the darkness. Or to use the example that we talked about, I think the first week, is that I love that story of Indiana Jones. You go and he comes to that edge and it's a leap of faith and nothing's there and he closes his eyes and steps out in spite of the evidence. And that's not what faith is. That's stupidity, in my opinion. What biblical faith is you pick what he did at the other end. You pick up the dirt and you throw it out there, and you still don't see the beam, but you see the outline of the beam. And if you throw the dirt out and it all falls to the ground, don't step out on that. And we're going to see that especially next week when we get to, for example, other religions and cults. I'm going to pick up a lot of dirt there and we're going to throw it out. They make religious claims and it's all falling to the ground. And that's vastly different than Christianity. And I'm saying, boy, if you step out there because you feel this is right, in spite of the evidence, that's stupid. That's not the kind of faith that God has called us to. So, likewise, when we look here at creation evolution, both are appealing to science. And the question is, we're saying, the ultimate question is, do the facts of science support the claims of creation or of evolution? That's what we're trying to look at these couple weeks. And I think it's a really, really important question that, that I hope that we can, we started at last week. I hope we can go a lot further this week. So let's try to look at some of this. And now we looked at a lot of things last week. What I'm going to do this week is not look. Last week we kind of looked more at life and this world and signs of life and evidences. And this week what I want to do is to kind of step back and again, when we talk about the transcendent. And there's so many things I'm not touching on. I could get into fossils, and we could get into. There's like so many things that you could get into. But what I want to do this evening is to spend a little bit of time looking at the kind of the big pictures of the cause of the universe. And so rather than kind of looking at Earth and looking at the development of life, and we're going to appeal to that very briefly. But I want to look at at kind of the bigger things with, the cause of the universe today. Now, I don't know, it's interesting, we had, last week we had some really clear skies and no moon, and it was funny, we had, my one son even came, he works kind of a weird shift. He works from about 11:30 till it gets done at like 7:30, or 11 to 7:30. So he gets, he's been getting home after dark now. And the other night he was coming home and he was walking in, and he starts walking in, and then he walks back out of the garage, and he looks out and he says, "Wow, there's a lot of stars." It was just, and it just really struck him, seeing, how many stars there are in the sky. And it was really beautiful. I don't know if any of you noticed that. And they say, have you ever thought about how many stars there are in the sky? It's been estimated that with the naked eye on a clear night in a dark location without a light pollution, you could see up to a couple thousand stars at most. If you had a simple telescope, that can go as high as 10,000. But that doesn't come close. Astronomers estimate that our galaxy, the Milky Way, contains 400 billion stars, which is an amazing number. And the thing is that we aren't the only galaxy. So what's happened with the Hubble telescope and these things like that is we've been seeing further and further. And so they've been, with Hubble Extreme Deep Field, they've been taking all these different pictures and then putting them together. And from what we know as of now, it's been estimated that there's an estimated 100 billion galaxies in the universe, and that's only as far as we can see. So it isn't that we've come to an end and there's nothing beyond that. It just is every time we go further, there's more, and that's as far as we can go. And so people are purely guesstimating that there may be 200 billion galaxies. Now, if we have 400 billion stars in our galaxy, and there's 1 to 200 billion galaxies in the universe, if you just measure that, they say that's approximately 10 to the 24th power stars, meaning it's 10 with 24 zeros after it, which that probably has a number, but I have no idea what it's called. It's just really a lot. Now, keep this in mind. How big the universe is. If you were to think about, again, here we are, our nearest star, if we think about, we have to measure by the speed of light. The speed of light is 186,000 miles per second, roughly. So that's roughly 670 million hours per hour. The Earth is 93 million miles from the sun. It takes about 8 minutes and 20 seconds for the light to get from the sun to the Earth. It takes about 43 minutes for the sun to get to Jupiter, about 5.5 hours to get to Pluto, what used to be a planet. Do you know how far it is to the nearest star? It's 4.2 light years. And so, it was interesting, we had talked about this where, I don't know if any was here, but even back a couple years ago, we did the solar system in the church here, and we built a scale model, and we had the sun was a volleyball, and the Earth was 30 feet away, and it was just a little tiny pebble. And in that case, we had Pluto that was down by AutoZone, and that was the scale model of our solar system. And we're this tiny little pebble, and the nearest star would be around Seattle, Washington. So, the universe is enormous in size, and we have 400 billion stars spread out in that kind of distance in our galaxy, and 100 to 200 to how many, we don't know how many hundred millions of galaxies. And what's amazing to me? Again, now I'm going to take the perspective that God created all that. And why did he have to create all that? It's like until recently, nobody was able to see these things. And you say, why did he have to create all that? I'm going to actually, if you're texting a question, I've just realized that it's not working, so I'm going to try to get Danny to help with the question or texting. So, you look at it and say, why is it that he did that? And he did it for no other reason to amaze us and to declare his glory. And when you realize that until, again, these last few decades when we had telescopes, and nobody could see any of these things. Nobody had any idea that there were galaxies out there. So I somehow got logged out. I reset it, so thank you. And when you look at that, I think about Isaiah. It talks about Isaiah 40:12. It says, "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span?" And here you have this galaxy and God saying, "It's about this big." It's just amazing to me. Or when we saw in the Psalms, it talks about the heavens declare the glory of God. And they do. And that's where, again, I look at that, and when I study those things, you just say, man, what a great God. And when you look at, last week we talked a little bit down to the very intricacy of the cell, and you could just, people are spending their whole lives trying to understand these things, and just, thank you very much, and not getting it. And then meanwhile, you have people that you can spend, we're just scratching the surface of the size of the universe. And the smaller you get, we can't get small enough to understand it. Bigger you get, we can't get bigger. And God controls it all, which is just an amazing thing to me. Now, understanding the majesty of the universe, the question is, where did it all come from? How did we get to where we're at? And that's a question that actually has been debated for thousands of years. And now I'm going to get to a little bit of philosophical language here, but stick with me. There's something called the cosmological argument. And this is something that there are multiple forms of this, that, different versions of it. But it's something that goes all the way back to predating Jesus. That people were kind of making this kind of an argument of really asking these questions of where does everything come from? And then what are our options? And the cosmological argument is just basically, it's a logical argument that goes from one step to another. And it just is simply this. It says, number one, everything had a beginning. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. And so it just is saying, okay, logically we know that there's nothing, if something had a beginning, nothing comes from nothing. You can't have nothing exist and then suddenly something starts to exist that didn't have a cause. So if something had a beginning, it had to have some kind of a cause. Now that's logically unarguable, right? We know that you can't have something come from absolutely nothing. The second part of it is to say the universe had a beginning. Now we're going to get into this and talk about whether this is true or not, but this is the argument. And you say, if the universe had a beginning, then we'll come to the third part of it. If everything that had a beginning had a cause, and which is true, and if the universe had a beginning, which we're going to talk about in a moment, therefore it's logical that the universe had a cause. That the universe had a cause outside of itself. All right? Now, that's the logical argument. Now, so let's ask this question. Really, it's saying, did the universe have a beginning? That's the key question. And so we're going to ask this question, where did everything come from? Did it have a beginning? We see everything. What are the options? Did it have a beginning? Or is it possible that it's eternal? And the fact of the matter is that if you were to look at history, actually from materialism, from a materialistic standpoint, now we're going to hear things, we hear about the Big Bang, things like that, and that's seen as, this is science, but we're going to see is that that's actually not what most, especially evolutionists, have believed for most of history. Most evolutionists for most of history, they're materialists, and what they believed historically is that the universe and matter are eternal. And they traditionally believed in what was called a static universe. And so that everything, in fact, I think of Carl Sagan's, beginning of the Cosmos series, the matter is everything that is and was and ever was, and this idea that matter has existed for all eternity, and so it's based on this materialism that the only thing that exists is the matter that we can see and touch, but it must be eternal, because if it didn't, then it had to have a beginning. And it's interesting that when you hear about the Big Bang, pretty much most of us say that if you hear about the idea of the Big Bang, you think that's an evolutionary theory, right? That is trying to disprove Christianity. Historically, the Big Bang was an idea that was first, now it wasn't called this at first. There was a Belgian priest in the 1920s that put out a theory that said when we start to be able to see and study light better, he put out this theory that said we're going to find that the universe is expanding. And his theory came primarily from creation, where it talked about in creation that God created and he flung the stars out. It talks about in the Psalms. And so he developed this theory that based on the Bible, that he would expect to see that there was an expanding universe, that when God created, that he created at a single point and then expanded it out. Now, this was a theory that was mocked by especially materialists and evolutionists at that time. And in mocking that, they made up the name Big Bang as a mocking name to describe this creationist and what he expected to find when we were able to look at science. So again, here's what we're going to see. We see this so often, what you see from a standpoint of creation or evolutionists. They have a theory. We expect to find this, and then you dig in there, you don't find it, and so then instead of saying, oh, we were wrong, it's like, well, how do we change the theory to fit the facts? Because we know that there can't be a God, we know that material has to be, and here's what happened. Is they're saying, no, we expect them with advanced telescopes, and lo and behold, what do we find? The universe is expanding. And so here you have basically all evolutionary scientists who were believing in the eternal nature of matter and the universe. That was the transcendent. Something has to be something transcendent. Something has to be eternal. Something has to be the source of everything. And matter, and that it's expanding, it blows up, and it expands, and somewhere there's a center of gravity, and the center of gravity in time will pull the universe back together so that it will contract again, and then it will all come together into one big point again, and it will crash together, and then it will expand again, and it will, so that what you've been happening is basically this view was that the history of the universe is that we've been this unending yo-yo effect of, blowing up, forming a universe, then goes how many millions, billions of years or whatever, and then over time it comes back. So again, I don't know if anybody's heard this. Now, what was the evidence of the expanding universe, or for the rebounding universe? Nothing. But the first theory of the static universe got shot down, and we still want to believe that matter is eternal because we don't want to admit that there's a cause outside of matter. So therefore, what theory can we get that would fit the facts that we know it's expanding? So let's make up a theory. Problem. Then we did more research. And what they found is, again, with the Hubble telescope, they found that not only is the universe expanding, but it's accelerating in its expansion. And so suddenly we can't now believe in this rebounding universe, because if it's expanding, that means it's blown up once, and in such a way that it's continue expanding. Now, beyond that, there's other problems. The law of entropy, you can't have an eternal universe because it would run out of energy, and there are other problems as well. But this is just one logical one. But it's proven that this whole theory was totally disproven. It's impossible now, because you can't have an accelerating universe and rebounding. It just doesn't work. So what does an evolutionist do? It's like, okay, well, my theory is proven wrong by the facts, so therefore I just changed the theory to fit the facts, because I know my theory is right in spite of the facts proving it wrong. And so what they did is they came up with theory 3, which is the Big Bang theory. And that is that everything was created from nothing. Now, what they did is, Big Bang started as a creation. It wasn't called Big Bang, that was the mockery name. But it was started out as a theory that we would expect to find if creation was true. Right? And everybody made fun of it and said, oh, that's stupid. It proved to be true, and instead of saying, oh, that proves creation, we have to try to reinterpret it and say, well, we know that evolution is true, so we've got to reinterpret the facts to fit. But now, suddenly, we know that there was a Big Bang one time. Matter is not eternal, and if you understand it, this gets in. This is way beyond my ability to science, and I'm not going to try to get too deep into it. But part of the whole, some of the theories with Einstein is that it had been proven true. It's not only that matter was created, but space and time itself. So that before the Big Bang, before creation, space and time didn't exist. So somehow space and time were created. Now let's go back to the cosmological argument. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning. So what started off by happening is to say everything had a beginning cause. That's logically true. So therefore, we have to argue that the universe didn't have a beginning, but over time we kept being proved wrong, and so now it's evidence that the universe has a beginning, so we have to go back and change the rules on the first one. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. And what is Big Bang? Saying that the universe, everything came from nothing. Literally, that's the whole idea. That the universe had a beginning, but either something caused it, created it into existence, or nothing did. And Big Bang is basically nothing. There wasn't even space. You can't say it was in space. There wasn't space, there wasn't time, there wasn't matter, there wasn't anything. And suddenly there was a singularity, which we don't know what that is, and we don't know where that came from. And so what created the singularity? But let's make up a word, we don't know what it is, so therefore we can say it existed and we don't know where it came from. And the singularity suddenly exploded, and out of nothing came everything. And it's not only everything, but when you talk about the size and the scope of the universe, that's an awful lot of everything that came from nothing. Now, it seems kind of implausible to me, this idea that that you have this universe that not only exists, we're going to see the design, but now we know that matter didn't exist, but so you have nothing that exploded, and that nothing exploded and suddenly created everything. And not only that, it was a really, really organized explosion, because it created everything in a way that organized itself into an incredible organization. Now, I don't know about you. Again, we started off by saying everyone has to believe in something transcendent. Everyone has to believe in something outside of nature. I don't know about you, but the idea that there was nothing and nothing suddenly created everything seems like a really big leap of faith to me that goes against reason. And again, you have creation or evolutionists that say that I'm anti-science. I mean, when you're denying something as logical as saying everything that had a beginning had a cause, and basically the Big Bang is saying, well, no, that's not true, or we could just make up a cause. It's called the singularity, and the singularity, that's the divine power that created everything. I tell you, a whole lot better argument is that there is a uncaused cause, that God is the uncaused cause. That what we read in creation is that in the beginning there was God, and God existed, and that's even the whole name we talked about in John a couple weeks ago. I am. What is the name I am? It's not that I was, it's not that I came to be, it's I am. That God's name is that I existed before creation. I'm the uncaused cause of everything. And I don't know about you, but that seems to be a whole lot more consistent with the facts than anything that creation is that evolution is throwing out there. So that's the first question. All right, and again, I'll give you a chance to comments or questions. If you want to ask a question online, please text at 330-644-6121. Any questions before and I'm just kind of going over this really quick. Any comments or questions? Keep going. All right. That in itself is a big problem, right? Where did everything came from? If we have the cosmological argument, everything that had a beginning had a cause. We've established that science proves that matter, that the universe had a beginning, therefore it had to have a cause. And so either the cause is nothing, or the cause is a transcendent God that exists outside of creation that looks a whole lot like what we read in Genesis 1. But even if you say that there is a nothing that can create everything, even if we say that, all right, if that's possible, I don't know how it's possible, but let's say it's possible, we still have an incredibly significant problem. And that is, how many of you have ever seen an explosion that organizes things? Now, the whole argument here is that you have this great explosion, and in this great explosion, it totally goes against the fine-tuning of the universe. And the question is, when you look at this incredibly fine-tuning of organization, how is this consistent? Now, again, I'm going to just kind of sum up some things that I wish I can go deeper on this, but I'm not the greatest scientist of this. I'm taking off things that I've read. They say, for example, that when you look at gravity, when the universe started to exist, there was a law of gravity. And the law of gravity, they say that if it varied by 1 to 10 in the 60th parts, meaning, again, 10 by 60 zeros after, that if it were off by just that little amount, then the universe wouldn't work. That if it was just a tiny bit more or less, then the universe would have spread out too rapidly, and the stars wouldn't have formed, and the universe couldn't have existed. If it was a tiny bit less, then it would have spread out and then not been enough, and it would have collapsed back on itself. And so the gravity was such a fine-tuning that it, and again, you think of this dial with 60 zeros after a 10, or the expansion rate. And again, it's not only gravity, but then whatever that, the Big Bangs, whether it's explosion or whether it's God, but if it was an explosion, let's call it that, it's an expansion rate. And they say that that number was 10 to the 120th. Again, so that you look at this dial and it's got numbers with 10 with 120 zeros after it. It's a lot of numbers. And it says if it's off by 1 point, that again, if it's too much of an explosion, it's too rapid, and again, stars don't form, the universe doesn't form. If it's just a little too less, then it all collapses back in on itself. They talk about the mass and energy, and again, they say that one's the balance between mass and energy. They talk about the nuclear, strong nuclear force and the weaker nuclear force, and there's all these different things that, again, I can try to go as best as I can. I'm not a deep scientist on this, but here's the idea that they say. It's kind of like if you think about this in terms of what we can imagine. If you have this incredibly complex system here, and you've got all these dials, and you've got all these different things, and you've got this incredibly complex, thing, and you've got, even if we just said here's 100 dials, and they all have 1,000 parts on them, okay, and that would be overly simplistic. And the chance of just taking these dials, and you got 1,000 dials, 100 dials, and they all go 1 to 1,000, and you've got to set them all to the exact number, or the whole thing doesn't work. And what's the chance that by explosion, explosion would be just coming through and just randomly hitting all those dials? What's the chance of all of those being perfect? And that's essentially what we're talking about here, that you look at the incredible fine-tuning of the universe, and you're saying, even if somehow nothing could somehow explode and create everything, the fact is this explosion would have to create order, and that order of life would have to be that level of perfection, even more. I mean, that's just overly simplistic. And if it was off by just a tad, see, the whole thing doesn't work. Fred Hoyle was an astronomer who coined the term Big Bang, and he said that his atheism was greatly shaken at these developments as they continued to learn. And look at his quote here. He says, I'm sorry, I thought I put this quote up here. Let me go ahead and read this quote. He says, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintelligent being has monkeyed with the physics as well as with chemistry and biology. The numbers one calculates from the facts seems to me so overwhelming as to put the conclusion beyond question. And so here he's looking at this and he's saying, I'm looking at these numbers, and what does he call it? A superintelligent being has monkeyed with the physics. And he says it's beyond question. And here's this guy that, again, is not a believer, but he's just looking at it and saying the facts, as we've seen from so many other people, it's like the only way to believe this is you believe it in spite of the facts. Because the facts clearly make evident that these things can't happen by accident. They just go against reason. In fact, you say, well, how do we try to explain these things? All right, there are different attempts. Again, one is that I mentioned even last week with some of the other things with creation, is that some try to say that we're really, 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 really lucky. And again, I used the example, last week of of a book that I read, and Richard Dawkins, and that was kind of his argument. His whole thing is he starts by saying everything possible that could happen has happened, and that's the only way to explain the one thing that is enormously impossible to happen by accident. It's happened because everything that could happen has happened. No, again, what's the evidence for that? There's another theory of that. There's a multiverse theory that says there's a machine that is churning out multiverses. Now, again, it's kind of this almost scientific perspective, your science fiction perspective. What's the evidence for the machine? 0. And it only multiplies the problem with the Big Bang. Well, how did the machine evolve? You see, there's no answer to that, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to find an answer to this question, to say, if everything has a beginning, has a cause, we don't want to believe there's a cause. We see a beginning, we see the organization. So how do we explain it with the assumption that we know that God's impossible? And they're just going against science. They're going against logic. They're going against evidence. And it's just, really when you interact with some of the stuff, it almost seems sad. It seems like, are you really that desperate to come up with some of these just really, really weird ideas? The other option, in the beginning, there was nothing but God, and an all-powerful God created the heavens and the earth, and he was not only super intelligent being, a supernatural being who had all divine power, and who created, not only fine-tuned, but he created all those laws, and then fine-tuned the universe to fit the laws that he created. And he did it with such a precision because he wanted us to find out that, it says in Genesis, that when we study creation, heavens declare the glories of God. That when we see this, it should be obvious to us that it couldn't have happened by accident, but the only possible answer is a all-powerful creator or designer has put all things into existence. So, yep. Yeah, and the question is, wouldn't it make sense that if there were the multiverses, that we would have other universes that exist, there would be evolution and things like that? Now, it's interesting in that, in science fiction, that is it's what's written. And so I haven't seen this one yet, but apparently one of the Marvel movies had somebody from a multiverse that came in, and it's become very popular in science fiction that you have these characters from other multiverses come in, so it allows you to bring in somebody that died, from a different multiverse, and now we have this guy, or you have two, I know Spider-Man, there was a Spider-Man into the multiverse, and there are multi-Spider-Mans, and so in science fiction, that's a common theme now. When you really study the science of it, it's really the science fiction is that we have this world, and we have multi-universes that could have evolved differently, and we have different versions of me and you, and we have all these different possibilities. The science of it was really based on this idea that you have to have, 10 to, again, if you look at one of these things and it's 10 to 132th power, that one thing has to be right. And you've got dozens of things that have to be right. The possibility of it happening by accident is it's beyond remotely small. And so the whole idea of the multiverse scientifically was that you have to have all these different universes for the one that actually works to actually exist. Because if it was by accident, if it was by nature, if it was by nothing somehow exploding and creating everything, all the explosions don't work except for this 1 to 10 to the millionth power, basically. So you have to have all these, and but the fact that you would have more than one that exists, it's impossible, because if any of those numbers are off, the universe doesn't exist. The laws of nature don't even allow for the stars to form, for universe to form, for life to form. And so science fiction says one thing. When you study the scientific theory of it, the whole theory behind the multiverse wasn't trying to explain how you could have multiple worlds. It's trying to figure out how you could possibly explain that we have one world. Because the fact that we have one world is amazing. It totally goes against all logic and all science if it is purely materialistic and chance. So does that make sense? That's a good question. And part of that is it's really funny how this language is being pulled into science fiction, into movies and things like that. And it's kind of seen as science, but in reality it's not science, because the science is just trying to get to one world, which itself is incredibly improbable. So, and not only that, but that plays into the next question. Okay, so now we have this fine-tuning of the universe, and could it happen by chance? Well, let's go to another question. It kind of refers a little bit to last week. But even if you could say that you have this universe that's fine-tuned, and even if you could get there, first of all, you have nothing that explodes to everything, which I don't know how that happens. And then you have this explosion that, instead of destroying things and creating chaos, actually created incredible order of such a magnitude that is beyond you can't even begin to describe it. So this incredible, minute matter, we're really, really lucky, according to Dawkins. But then, even if you get order and you have the formation of stars and galaxies and planets, well, then how do you have life? So what is the origin of life? And we talked about this a little bit, last time, just briefly. But let me kind of we kind of looked at the detail last time of talking about the formation of the proteins and the protation of a cell and the formation of DNA, and looking at all these things. But if I were to look at any one of those things, and you could say the chance that proteins formed by themselves, impossible. The chance of amino acids forming by themselves, and now you need to have not only the proteins, but they need to come together in a certain order, impossible. The chance of those then forming together and bringing together and then forming a cell, impossible. The chance of that cell somehow coming to life, when you look at the detail of what a single cell organism is, impossible. The fact that it has an incredible amount of information, and that information coming from nowhere, impossible. And so basically Darwin's theory was that the single cell was really the simple protoplasm, and it could just be lightning somehow zapped it to life, and it was really simple. But what you find is that life itself is incredibly complicated. Now, this is where you get science and science fiction kind of blending. All right? Why is it, when you think about, we have not only all this stuff about, all these science fiction movies about extraterrestrials and, other worlds, but we have scientists that are out there that have, SETI, that are sending satellites out, that trying to listen for aliens talking to us from the sky, and they haven't yet. Why is there such interest in that? And the reason is that there's interest because from a evolutionist standpoint, they want to believe that life is pretty easy to start, that life could have evolved. And we want life to be easy, and so because we want life to be easy, therefore it makes an easy explanation for here. So we are looking for it other places. And if we find it other places, well, that should give evidence to the idea that it was able to evolve here. The problem is, the more we've learned about life and the formation of life, the more that we found the chance of it evolving by chance is just about as likely as the universe organizing itself spontaneously. Now, we're not even talking about evolution. We're talking about, you're saying, a lot of evolution is saying, okay, you have a single life form, and that life form was able to somehow adapt, and survival of the fittest, so it was able to adapt and improve itself, and over time to change. We're talking, where did the first single cell life come from? Where did life begin? And as much as a problem of, we can look at all the facts of saying, how did you get from the single cell to the human being? And as impossible as that is, the fact is, the problem to say, how did you get from from nothing, from minerals, from what existed on the earth to the single cell form of life, that's a bigger problem than all this. I mean, it's at such a level of impossibility that again, people have tried to say, okay, how do you do this? And again, here's some of the explanations. Richard Dawkins, the anthropic principle, which is really beneficial, right? It's kind of like when you can ever say, hey, it's impossible, but hey, we're here, so we got really lucky. You've got, and actually another one that has become, again, more somewhat popular now is something called panspermia. Now, this theory is basically that life evolved on another planet, and those aliens came to Earth, and somehow in their spaceship, they may have intentionally planted life. More likely, they had some simple life cells that kind of fell out of their spaceship and fell onto Earth, and because Earth was a somewhat conducive environment for the formation of life, that simple life that they accidentally dropped here on Earth began forming. So we're all really aliens. And now, what's the evidence for panspermia? Nothing. But what it's saying is, what you have people saying, we've come to the conclusion that when you look at the age of the earth, the chance of, the whole thing about evolution is that if you just give enough time, then magic happens. If you just give it enough time, then anything can happen, things can come together. But you have people that are saying, come to realization that when you look at the amount of time that the earth has existed, even by the most 4 billion years, by the most generous academics from an evolutionary standpoint, if you look at that time, there's not enough time for life to even have started, let alone to evolve. That it just doesn't work. It goes against all the logic. It's just impossible. So the logic of panspermia is, well, maybe there's a world where it's easier. There's no evidence for it, but maybe there's a world where it's easier, so let's believe in the world that's easier, and life happened there. Now, we don't have to answer the questions of how it happened there because we don't know that world. We don't know, the rules of science there, but let's just assume that it was easier and that it happened here and they dropped life here and that got us started. Now, what are they doing? Everything that has a beginning has a source. Life had a beginning, so therefore life had a source. And what they're doing is they're saying that you can't go around that. And if you say, okay, well, what the source is itself, spontaneous generation of life, that's impossible. That's what science is proving. It's not only unlikely, it's not only extremely unlikely, it's at such a level of impossibility that some are just having to admit that. But rather than say, okay, well, we have two possibilities. There's a creator and there's by evolution. Evolution is proven impossible. Therefore, let's go back and consider creator. Rather than do that, what do? Well, we know that all that can exist in the universe is material being, a source. So therefore, hey, let's make up a transcendent, outside of our nature, a transcendent being, an alien, that we don't have to explain its source because we don't understand its rules of science. And against all evidence, that came and dropped life to get us started. Now, let me ask you, what better fits the facts? We started off and you have these two stories. Okay, one story, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. He spoke these into existence. The other story is, in the beginning there was nothing, and nothing exploded, and suddenly there was everything, and somehow that explosion created great order, and it organized everything, and suddenly, out of something of an order, suddenly, magically, life suddenly appeared. Or life appeared somewhere else, and then an alien came and dropped it, or there's a machine that's churning out multiverses, and we're the one that works. Or does it make sense? I mean, it's really sad, and we saw that one quote last week. That one guy saying, why do we believe this? We believe it in spite of the evidence. We believe it in spite of, why? Because we're committed to this a priori commitment to believe in material causes. And therefore, we can't let the divine foot in the door. We can't even acknowledge that Because the moment we do, if you really openly say there's a possibility that God exists and a possibility that God doesn't exist and that there's science, and if you really openly, with a bit of honesty, look at both of those things as possibilities, and you say which one is more consistent with the science, with the evidence, it's not, when I say it's not even close, I mean, that's an understatement. The evidence is so strong for creation. Heavens declare God's glory. And it's really tragic that for so many people, when we hear this subject, so many Christians think that, oh, I got to stay away from this. I got to stay away from science, or that, and they just think that, or they think, well, I know science says this, but the Bible says this. And it's just not true. And it's something we need to grow in our confidence, and we need to be able to share with other people, and we need to defend, biblical perspective on these things. Because it's truth, and it's such an important issue. It's an important issue that shapes our thinking on so many different things as well. And so we're going to talk about morality, but it talks about not only that, but you think about, about family structure and social order and all these different things. And so even, for example, let's take family structure. When you had the whole Obergefell decision about legalizing homosexual marriage, okay, the justice that wrote the opinion, the reason that he talked about this is he appealed to evolution of our evolution of thought. Now here's what you have to realize, is that either we are created with a structure, and we have a structure that's not only our biological structure, but it's a structure of order, it's a structure of society, it's a structure of family, and we want to be faithful to that, or we evolve from nothing, and nothing is set. And not only that, but the theory of evolution is everything is progressing. And so what do we see even politically now? What do you hear about, how many times do you hear about progressives in politics? Progressives, we're evolving. And my view on this issue has evolved, meaning it's gotten better. Now you see, if you believe in it, and unfortunately you have a lot of Christians get pulled into this, they get pulled in the language, and they don't understand that what they're doing is even that thought is based on evolutionary theory that's a rejection of creationism. And that's why this is such an important issue. It's such an important issue that we understand, that we're able to defend, that we're able to talk about, that we're able to interact with on so many issues. So, now, I could go a lot longer. There's a lot more on the whole, creation, evolution, these other resources. I hope it's been a good overview before we go to the next thing. But any comments or questions before we go to that next part, which is kind of morality and how it relates? Nope, good with me? Again, you could text in if you have any questions or comments as well. All right, now let's talk about this next issue, and it's a big question, probably one of the harder questions, right, wrong, where's God, how's evil, but it's also related, it is all related to evolution. And how do we define what's right and wrong? Where do the ideas of right and wrong come from? And this is, again, these are, even in these discussions, this is a part of this that we've got to really think through, and we don't really think through very well. What you believe about where you came from, if we're a product of an unguided evolutionary force, or if you're created and designed by an all-powerful, all-loving God. And the answer to that question will completely define your understanding of right and wrong. And even your struggle with understanding concepts of evil. If you believe in evolution, you have to ask the question, is there such thing as right and wrong? If you believe in evolution, what's the basis of saying anything is right or wrong? Is morality and ethics, the question of what's right and wrong, one that should be defined by, again, this concept of evolutionary thinking, progress morality? Should it be defined by democratic vote, in a sense, and whatever we think there, the majority of the people? Or if we really believe in creation, then it's going to be defined by a loving God who has woven that truth into creation. because the concept of morality is intrinsically tied into the whole concept of creation. Because the question is this, it's, again, when you look at these things and you say, these claims about creation and evolution, it's historical, it's science, it's morality, it's religion. But think about it this way. Both in our biological design and our design of society and morality, is there anything greater than us? Is there transcendent? Is there something that existed before us, that created us, that gave us structure? Naturalism declares that nature is all that there is. So there is no reality outside of natural causes. So therefore, we're not only biologically the result of naturalistic evolution, but as the most evolved species, there's nothing then greater than us. But it also reflects on our ideas of morality and social structures. If there's no God that has created us, there's no God above us to define what's right and wrong. So then that leads to a huge question, and I think a huge problem. If you believe in evolution, what's the basis for morality? Where does the idea of right and wrong come from? Is there such thing? Can we say there's such thing as a moral absolute? Something that is always wrong or something that is always right? We live in a world of moral relativism, changing morality. But even in that, there are certain things that I think most people, the vast majority, if not all, would say that are wrong. Now we might say, okay, sexually, well, okay, I believe that some people would say, okay, homosexuality, well, we need to rethink that. And some people, we're going to come back and we'll transgender them, we're going to rethink that. And okay, well, how about rape? Is rape wrong? Why? Why is rape wrong? Now I'll even argue, how about pedophilia? Now there are people that are arguing that pedophilia is not wrong now. And as long as the child is willing and that if you do it in a loving manner, and the thing is that seems shocking, but it shouldn't be, because the fact of the matter is that if you believe in evolution, why would it be wrong? If there is no intrinsic absolute truth of right or wrong above us, then why are they wrong? If think of it this way, what is the defining rule of evolution? What drives evolution? What makes it work? It's the rule of survival of the fittest, right? Now, if the survival of the fittest is what makes evolution work, then why is murder wrong? In fact, some people would say, well, okay, if it's culturally, well, what if the culture says it's okay? What if the vast majority of the people, if you have, a group that says, hey, we want to do ethnic cleansing, get rid of this group of people, and everybody agrees we want to get rid of this group of people, why is it wrong? And the fact of the matter is that when you talk to an evolutionist, they have a really hard time explaining this. In fact, there are some that start talking about how, that we need to borrow from Christian ethics. There's a few that are, I forget the guy's name, but he's written some books on this, and he's really trying to say, I want to have a belief in an ethical system, but I realize that there's no basis for it from evolution, so I've got to close my eyes and borrow from this and take something from Christianity and then kind of bring it into this, and I don't know where it came from, but I can't believe, and I've got to believe that there's such thing as right and wrong. So what we've got to realize is that, on the other hand, it's only if the world is designed and created by God, only that gives us any basis for morality. And if God is the basis for morality, then that totally understands not only where morality comes from, but it should define our understanding of morality. That, again, we're going to see in a moment that it's aligning, it's not evolving, but it's aligning with what was established at creation. Now, you want a good example of evolutionary ethics? If there was a culture that was built on evolutionary ethics more than anything else, it's Nazi Germany. Now, whatever we think about Nazi Germany, think about this. What were the driving factors? What do we think of Nazi Germany for? Okay? Well, we think of, killing of the handicapped. Well, why were they killing the handicapped? Because they were unfit. They were a drain on society. What does evolutionary say we should do? Survival of the fittest. Okay, they said we're going to kill the Jews and other inferior races. Now, if indeed these races are inferior, isn't that exactly what evolution says that we should do to progress into a higher state of existence? Now, if they were not inferior, then they should be able to fight back and win the battle, and the fact that they won the battle proves that they aren't inferior. But what is the basis for them to be able to say that they aren't inferior? Or that it's wrong to do that, or it's wrong for one group to try to kill the other to try to prove their superiority? There's no basis. And what you see in Nazi Germany, as much as people hate that, and people try to argue against it, but it was completely driven by a moral ethic that drew from evolutionary thought. That's where it completely came from. Now, the only other option is to say, okay, if you want to believe in any moral system, if you want to believe that anything is right or wrong, the only way for you to have any sense of right or wrong, something that is transcendent, something that's always right, the only way for you to say that murder is always wrong, or rape is always wrong, or now we have racism, that racism is always wrong. What is the basis? The only basis to say anything is right or wrong is to have a transcendent being that exists outside of us that establishes that right or wrong, that doesn't change with time. And that comes from God. And so it's the only other hope is that God is a moral designer, and that therefore it's our job to be able to understand that design. See, our world is saying what? That we live in a changing society and we need to evolve. And what we need to realize is that no, if God created the world and designed its moral structure, it means that it does not change. And if God's moral structure doesn't change, that it means not only it doesn't change, it can't be changed. Because it's designed to fit the world system. And so our goal shouldn't be to evolve further along, but it should be, in a sense, to be able to look back and to see what was firmly established in the beginning. And the further back we go to the original, the healthier that we're going to be. The more that we evolve away from the original, the more unhealthy we become. Now, how does the Bible teach this? The Bible teaches that God has woven His moral law into the fabric of the world. And I love what we might. I'm looking at doing this in the summer, but it's maybe something in Proverbs. But I love how Proverbs talks about this. It's Proverbs 8, for example. Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads she takes her stands. Beside the gates and the towns, in the entrance of the portal she cries. And it's talking about wisdom and personifying wisdom. And look what it says in verse 22. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of His work, at the first acts of His old. Ages ago I was set up at the first before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains were shaped. Before the hills I was brought forth. Before the earth was filled with its fields. When He established the heaven I was there. He drew a circle on the face of the deep. He made firm skies below. He established the fountains of the deep. And basically what he's saying is that God created wisdom into the fabric of the world. And so just as you see the laws of nature, of gravity and things like that wisdom is built in there just in the same way. And that means what's right and wrong. And so when you talk about moral life, it's even going beyond that. It's not just even what's right or wrong. It's a question of what is right. It's the second part of it. It's not only that, it defines what's true and how life works. And so let's talk about family and sexuality. Okay, God's design is that there's man and woman, and He's designed that we are ideally to be engaged in a long-term marital relationship, and that children are only to be had within that marital relationship. That's not only a question of right and wrong, it's a question of what's true and how life works. So the further we get away from that, the more dysfunctional our world becomes, the more dysfunctional families become. The more aligned we are, the healthier we become. Because it's a discussion of what's true and of what God works. It's just as true as what gravity is. Now, so when you look at this, it's this idea of it's something that is transcendent and unchanging because it's rooted in the transcendent being of who God is Himself. Therefore, it's something that doesn't change. It doesn't change with time. As our culture changes, our greatest health is not realized by evolving to a higher state, but it's understanding and aligning ourselves with the way that we are designed. It's going back, and the more that we align ourselves with our design, the healthier we are. Now, that leads to the last question we're going to end up, which is kind of this big question. The question of how God and the problem of evil. And again, I'm just going to touch on this, and we could go a lot deeper. But how many of us have heard that question? How could a loving God allow evil? If God is really loving, if God is really good, then how could He allow evil in the world? And I run into that not infrequently, and especially as people experience some evil, you look at something and you see, people that have been the victims of abuse and things like that. How could that happen? Well, let me start by saying there is a logical contradiction to the question. When you ask, how could a good God allow evil? The answer really, at the core, now I wouldn't necessarily start there. There's emotional time, there can be an emotional struggle with a lot of people that ask this question. But the people that are just trying to create an argument is to say, well, the moment that you ask that question, you assume that there's a good God. The fact that you ask that question proves that there's a good God. What do you mean? Well, the fact that you're saying that you know that there's an evil, the only way for there to be an evil is that there's a good God. If there's no God, if there's not a God, and if there's not a God who's good, then what's evil? Well, there's rape and genocide, and well, why is that evil? The fact that you know that there's evil assumes that there's a transcendent being outside of us that's good and that defines good, and what's opposed to Him is evil. And if you don't allow for that transcendent being that exists outside of that is good and defines good, then there is no such thing as a definition of evil. And the very fact that you're bothered by evil shows you that you know that there's a good God. In fact, you cannot ask that question at all without the assumption of the fact that there's a good God. Because apart from a good God, there's no evil. Apart from the good God, all you can look at is you could say, we live in a broken world, and this is the way we expect it should be because it's driven by natural forces, the survival of the fittest. And in fact, the survival of the fittest isn't necessarily even evil. That's actually good. Because it's the killing of the less desirable peoples and doing away genocide and things like that. That's how the survival of the fittest happens. That's how we've evolved as a race. That, by evolutionary theory, is itself not only not evil, it's actually good. And the only way for you to even have a concept of evil is to realize that there is a good God outside of us that defines good and therefore likewise defines evil. Does that make sense? I mean, that seems like a really simple answer, but the fact of the matter is, we get thrown that question all the time, and we don't realize, we don't just follow the logical contradictions of it.
I love the way you explain that. And whenever someone asks that question, their primary goal is trying to discredit the idea of the existence of God.
Yeah.
But the acknowledgement of evil means you're acknowledging if someone can tell you what's right and wrong.
Yeah, and what he said is that most people that ask the question are really trying to argue against the existence of God, and that's true. Now, I will say that I get asked that from people who are really victims of evil. And so I get asked that from people that are victims of abuse, that are victims of, that have really suffered. And for me to answer them that way wouldn't be pastorally appropriate. Because they're really not, a lot of times those people aren't they're not trying to disprove God. They're trying to say, I'm trying to find God and I don't understand him in the context of all this evil. And so you have that group of people that I've got to answer very, very differently. I've got to answer very sensitively and pastorally. But the fact is, what you're saying is right, is that a lot of people, I'd say the majority of people that I hear give that argument, they're really not struggling with the evil that they experience. They're really trying to disprove God. And the fact of the matter is, you have to assume God to ask the question. If you don't assume that there's a good God, you can't even ask that question. And the fact is, you know that there's evil, so therefore, the very fact that you know that's evil actually is an evidence. Your question isn't an argument against God, it's actually an evidence for God. Now, once there's a good God, we still have to explain evil. And so then how do we explain evil? Well, what's the source of evil? Well, I think one of the things you have to say, well, did God create evil? This is theological questions. We could spend weeks on this one question, and we're going to spend about 3 minutes. Did God create evil? Well, the question is what's right and what's good. And sometimes the idea is that when we ask that question, we almost have this idea of saying, well, God started and he created matter and he created people and then he created rules. And that's kind of often the idea. And then he said, okay, well, I'm going to create rules and I'm going to create, okay, you can't do this and you should be married here and you should be, so I'm going to create good and then I'm going to create evil. And that's when that question almost assumes that picture, and it's a totally wrong picture. Because what happened is that God created the world, and where does good come from? Where does truth come from? It's not God. God didn't create it. They're expressions of his character. God is good. God is love. God is truth. God is all those things. And so, and when you see even, we talk about wisdom being woven into creation, when you look at these ideas, even if you talk about family and sexuality, the more deeply you get into it, you see these are all expressions of God's character. They're actually, they're not just God said, well, I'm going to make man and woman, and should they have one spouse or many, or should they just sleep around? Or no, it's actually rooted in the character of God. It's rooted in the Trinity. It's actually, these things are. The concepts of love and of faithfulness and of commitment, these are all expressions of God's character. So goodness isn't something that God created, that God said, I think I'll make good and I think I'll make bad. Why didn't he just make good? Well, no, God is good. And what he did is in the garden, he basically have said, okay, now I'm good, and I'm going to give you the choice to be able to embrace me or to reject me. And what is evil? Evil is rejecting God. Evil is, in fact, if you want to, really even, C.S. Lewis has written some wonderful stuff on this, even the concept of hell and what is hell. And hell is, again, we have this perception. God created this place, and it's just a really bad place for punishment. You know what hell is? Hell is the absence of God. You want a place of ultimate evil? It's where we are totally absent from God. You're absent from everything that God is. You're absent from his goodness, from any sense of love, from any sense of beauty, from any sense of joy, from all these things that who God is. They're totally removed from that. And why is it? Is God punishing people? No. People said, you didn't want it in existence without me? You've got it. That's what God is doing. And so what is evil? Evil is the rejection of God. And God, in giving us free will, he gave us the ability to make the choice to accept or reject him. But in choosing to reject him, what happened is that also opened up the door for evil. It allowed us to be able to reject him in big ways and small ways. And the further we get away from rejecting God, the greater the evil. And that's not only a matter of evil and things that are done to us, but the fact is that creation itself has been broken. So now that we experience evil even in creation, so we experience earthquakes and we experience hurricanes and we experience all kinds of diseases, and we experience all this brokenness. But they all come from sin. They come from our rejection of God. And you look at this and you say, okay, is God the source? Well, no, God gave us the choice. But the fact of the matter is that, see, I can look at this person and say, well, that person, they abused their kids. They abused, my dad abused me, and that was evil, and how could that allow to happen? Okay, let me ask the question, have you done anything that is ever evil? Have you lied to someone? Have you ever, hurt someone? Have you done things that was harmful for another person? And all of us would say yes. Well, why did God allow that evil? Why didn't God stop you? Why didn't God strike you dead before you hurt another person? You think, well, it wasn't that bad, and God, okay, so where should God allow freedom and allow me and you to do things that may hurt other people, and where should he stop this other person? And the fact is that, no, he has allowed evil, and in the evil and the brokenness when we allow God, it isn't that he is the source of evil, but he allowed us to reject him and to reject his truth. So evil isn't something that God created. As evil is by very nature, it's the absence of God. It's the rejection of God. And so you have a good and loving God who allows people to reject not only him, but allow what's good and what's loving. And the consequences of that are evil upon ourselves as well as evil upon others. And we understand that. We're okay when we hurt people and it's not that bad, and we don't think that God should strike us dead, but somehow we think other people should be. See, when you look at the Bible, is there a perfect answer to all these things? Is it something that's going to make me feel totally comfortable? No, but it explains it in a way that makes a whole lot of sense. You see, but when we look at the Bible, we can say, well, what's the source of evil and why does God allow it? Well, God, in a sense, has allowed it because he's allowed us to reject him. But the story of the Bible isn't God allowing evil, it's God coming and bringing a cure for evil. And even when you look at this, I want you to think about this. Understand the cross. Understand that you have Jesus, who is the creator, the most innocent being of all creation, coming and taking upon himself ultimate evil. Taking the role of the ultimate victim. And when we look at that and say, God, why do you do that? And what God's saying is, I understand that this is a world and this is the consequence of the choices that we as humanity have made, and there are people that face those consequences in really tragic ways. And again, that's not only just in being victimized, that's in being born with handicaps, it's being exposed to natural disasters. It's all these things. And there are people that are exposed to that and face incredible consequences, and that's a tragic thing. But the whole story of the Bible is that God allowed that, and he has ever since been coming and actually entering into human history to be a cure for that evil. To say, okay, if you again, without getting into this in great detail, if you really want to understand the whole nature of the gospel is it's Jesus Christ came and he's begun the process of reversing the curse. So that now you see people that are doing evil and abusing and things like that. Okay, now those hearts are changed, and now those people become somebody different. And you see brokenness in the culture, and you see sickness, and you see, well, Christians are stepping in and becoming doctors and bringing healing, and they're setting up places like Haven of Rest, and they're bringing hope, and they're supplying needs, and there's charities and things like that. Why? Because Christians are moving into this world, and they're reversing consequences of the curse, because the gospel is the ultimate cure to evil. And it's a cure to evil that Jesus Christ paid for. How? By ultimately taking more than any other human being in all of existence ever could. Taking the weight of evil, taking evil upon himself, taking the suffering of evil, so that he would take our suffering so that he could bring healing. Now, does it bring ultimate healing? Does it? Does it make our world perfect? And no. Does it bring ultimate healing? Yes. And that's one of the things that when you look at that and you say, well, what's the problem of evil? And saying, well, okay, there's a problem of evil. God has allowed this, but he's allowed it, and he uses it then to point us to himself and to point us to the cure. And the fact is that if we discover the cure, what happens is that we discover in time not only this beginning of reversing of the curse, but the ultimate reversing of the curse, so that we are healed and that we are that we're ultimately rewarded back with the perfection of creation that we were longing for. And so part of us to say, how can a loving God allow evil? A loving God would want perfection, and that's true. And the fact is, he allows evil because of the fall and to make us aware of our need to be able to drive us to see the cure, because if we see the cure, the fact is ultimately he will heal us from all evil and bring us back to the Garden of Eden that we were created for and that we long for. And the very fact that we're struggling with this not only proves that there is a good God, but the fact that we struggle for it and that part of our soul says that we are longing for Eden, we know that we're created for another world, it's actually driving us not only towards a good God, but it's pointing us to the cure for the cure of evil and the ultimate perfection that we're created for. And so the whole thing, it's not a disproof of God. It's actually a proof of God. It's not an easy. I don't want to make it easy or simple, because it's not. But what you see is that it actually drives us towards God. It doesn't drive us away. And that I find great hope. Well, we've gone through a lot today, and as we have each week. And again, I'll let you know for next week, we've got, just making sure that we hadn't had anything come in. Nope. Next week, we are going to be talking about, world religions, this whole idea of, aren't all religions the same? And we're also going to be spending time talking about cults. And, so how do we answer some questions related to world religions as well as some cults? And so if you, have any thoughts, just be thinking about that. We look forward to, each week it's a big change. It's like this is the only week where we've kind of had two weeks that have been kind of similar in theme. And next week we're going to change pace, and the week after that we're going to change pace. And, but hopefully when we look at all this, I hope it's helpful. It is really wonderful knowing these kind of confidence that we can have in truth. And I hope it's helpful to you. Let me close in prayer. Father, I thank you for the privilege of this time, for the opportunity we have to spend this time digging into these truths. Thank you for the things that are here. Father, I thank you that you give us reason to have such confidence in our faith. Father, I pray for your blessing on each one of us, that we would become more and more confident not only in what we believe, but Father, even the ability to not only stand strong in our own belief, but even to talk with others, to share with others, to help young people to defend their faith. And Father, even in time to be able to interact with skeptics in such a way that ultimately may open up a door to lead them towards Christ. Father, thank you again. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you.